All right, guys. I think we've got everything up and running. I'm coming to you live from Montreal. Just finished taking a giveaway class. So I'm really constantly trying to learn and get better. And I think he's one of the smartest guys as far as how the body works and how different parts relate to each other. Um, I think I got the microphone all good, but please, I'll check the comments. Let me know if there's any problems with the audio. Had it once before and would hate to go too far down the rabbit hole having it again. But I want to thank everybody who's here trying to get some questions answered. If you have a second, just post your name and your location in the chat box. And if you have any questions, please list them there. I'll check into that as we go through. I've got a good list of questions from the members of the website who sent in their emails beforehand, and so we will let's get into stuff. So I don't have my mini golf club. I'm staying in an Airbnb, so I'm going to be using my one of the kitchen utensils, which is a great way for at-home training. Club face control, definitely one of my go-to training aids. I actually like, or practice aid, I should say. I actually like the flat section for the grip, or the flat handle. Very much like the messing around with a ruler. So, all right, anyway, let's jump into some of these questions. So, Vaughn asked about the 2040 takeaway. He's been doing the 2040 takeaway, which is basically when you make your backswing and you get to about shaft parallel, having your hips turned about 20 degrees, shoulders turned about 40 degrees. He compared that to, in the past, he's tried to do more of everything turning together in the backswing, and he was asking success, or he's having success, and he was basically asking for permission, which a lot of my students do. You know, there's so much conflicting information out there that just having someone you can go to and say, does this make sense? Is this something I should keep working on? Can be helpful, especially in the early stages of learning. So, yes, he was talking about how it seems to improve his transition sequencing. The danger of the hips over rotating and the club getting too much inside, or I should say the danger of over rotating and using too much lower body, is that the club can get too much inside. So if everything turns, the club can get too much inside during the takeaway. And the problem is, if the club gets too much inside and the golf ball's out there, I'm now going to have to start pulling too much in the direction of the target, and that can lead into an early extension pattern. So a lot of golfers benefit from getting more of a feeling of a one-piece takeaway, or using a little bit more of their upper body, not just the hips in the takeaway. When they do that, they're able to keep their weight distribution a little bit easier, and it's not uncommon to then have improved sequencing and transition. So, absolutely, Vaughn, you've got my permission to continue with it. Had a question from Glenn. Glenn was asking about two of the hot topics. So, the theme of this class is more the big movements of the golf swing. So, a lot of the questions that came in were relating to either the motorcycle or transition sequence or weight shift. So I thought that I'd just kind of wrap them all together and make the big theme about the big movements. Well, his question was about two of the hot topics in golf instruction being external rotation and twisting the club, or what we refer to as the motorcycle. And he was basically asking, what are my thoughts on those two? I use those as part of my teaching. Transition is a key differentiator between elite level golfers and amateur golfers, or poor level golfers. There are patterns that tour pros tend to do in transition to help create speed and control the path. And two of the major pieces that really jump out are the arm shallowing, or the center mass of the club getting behind or below the hand path, so getting the club to drop a little bit more on the inside compared to where the hands are going, and earlier club face rotation, or earlier twisting or squaring of the club face. Those two patterns seem to be integral into having more of a body rotation pattern on the way through. So that's part of the reason why you see a lot of golf instruction kind of trending towards those two key movements. Now, I always, one of my goals is to help golfers understand how pieces match together, so that you're not trying to necessarily create a perfect golf swing, but you're trying to build the ability to adapt by understanding how pieces fit together. So the arm shallowing and the club face rotation works well with a body powered swing, which then works well with kind of a delayed arm extension timing and good body rotation on the way through. So all these pieces need to fit together, but the two key movements of arm shallowing and face rotation during transition tend to be a couple of the early downswing patterns that jump out at us when you look at the numbers. So I think there's a lot of comments there because I think it's a key differentiator, and it's anytime something becomes trendy and you get a lot of success working on it, it's bound to pick up steam and become more popular. Okay, Trevor had a specific question about external rotation during transition, and basically he's having trouble figuring out how to get down to the golf ball with external rotation. So this one will be a little bit more demo based and a little bit more specific than just why your instructor is talking about external rotation. So external rotation is more of this rotation of the trail arm away from the target or away from the body, like so. And what can happen is when a lot of golfers demonstrate it, they'll try to really keep, here I'll angle this up just a little bit, so they will try to keep this elbow pretty high, so it ends up looking like this. Now you can see that my right forearm in this position is pointing well up above the golf ball. So the key is, how do I get this external rotation and get the club, or get that forearm pointing more down at the golf ball? Because that forearm is going to have to point down at the golf ball in order for me to control low point and get the club down to the golf ball. So if I get this external rotation and it's high, I have two options. I can either bend more from my hips, but eventually that just becomes a very unathletic position. If I bend too much from the hips, it's likely I'm not going to be able to rotate or use as much vertical force. I'm not going to be able to really use my pivot as well. So then it becomes, how do I externally rotate and get that forearm to point down, so allowing that right arm to straighten just a little bit while still keeping that external rotation position? Because yes, this is external rotation, but this is also external rotation. So from the face-on view, that is external rotation, but so is that. And training it to be a little bit more of the movement where it's external rotation but more in line with the shoulder can help you get the shallowing movement but also control low point. So I tend to see that as a key differentiator. All right, so I know that I see a few questions coming in, so I'll take a quick break from the pre-scheduled ones and I'll jump in. It looks like Dennis had a question about strategies to get the sternum facing down ahead of the ball by impact. Tendency is to be late in rotation. Okay, so what he's talking about is getting the sternum, so I'll use this as my reference, but basically getting the sternum to be pointing out ahead of the golf ball at impact. In order to do that, the arms have to be more behind my body when I'm making contact, and my arms have to kind of delay their timing in order to allow my body to get open. If my arms start getting involved too soon and they are working more across my body like so and getting out in front of my sternum, I'm never going to get open. So the normal progression would be, all right, how can I hit some golf balls making sure that my chest is open or my sternum is pointing where I want it to be? So first thing I would do is I would use something like the merry-go-round, and I would preset a good impact position, and then I would do some little release drills or 9 to 3s from there. If the second I started moving the club, video showed, or I could see on a mirror that I wasn't getting open, then I would backtrack it even further and I would do something like the push ball drill just to get used to the body being open when those arms extend. So I would work on the position, then I would get the movement, then I would get contact with the ball with the movement, and then I would throttle back into more like a 3/4 swing or maybe even full swings, trying to duplicate that same position. But you've got to work through a logical progression, especially if you keep banging your head up against the wall. Basically, if you're making the same mistake, you've got to really either slow it down or shorten it in order to give your brain more time and space in order to coordinate that movement. So I would do merry-go-round drill, I would do push ball drill, I would do impact fix, I would do follow-through drills, everything getting used to the body being open and the arms more behind. And if you start to find that when you do that, you either top the ball, hit the ball thin, have trouble with low point control, have trouble with face control, that will point you down what's the most logical next steps. Okay, Justin was asking, what are the keys to having the low point target side of the ball without swinging too much outside in? So the keys to that, basically what he's asking is if I actually don't have a golf ball. I'm confident that there's not one here in this Airbnb. So we'll take the mouse and we'll say that here's the golf ball. What he's saying is basically, if I'm swinging through the golf ball, how do I get the low point out in front of the golf ball like so without swinging too much outside in? Because when I swing outside in, that does tend to get the low point more forward, but it gives me a very challenging path to work with, right? It gives me more of a glancing blow. So in order to get the low point forward, I need to have my arms extend more out at the target. So the two main factors for what control low point are where is your chest turning or your sternum pointing, and the straightness of your arms, specifically that trail arm, since the right hand is furthest down on the grip. So if the right hand is trying to get into a wrist position like that and a straight arm, your bottom of the swing is always going to be further back. If your chest goes more standing up and you're pointing more at the golf ball instead of down and in front of it, you will always struggle with the bottom of the swing being behind the golf ball. So in order to get the bottom of the swing out ahead of the golf ball, but not come from the inside, not come from the outside, come more from the inside, I have to have earlier face closing, so I have to have the motorcycle movement, which there are a couple of questions on and we'll get to next. I have to have more of the hands more in front of the chest in order to get that arm extension out there, and my body has to be slightly closer to the ground and more rotated and side bent. If you get that pattern, that typically creates the situation where you'll get shaft lean and you'll get the low point out in front of the golf ball without swinging too much outside in. If I had to pick just one of those to work on, it would be more of the face rotation component. Because the more you shallow things and the more you delay the closing of the club face, or the more you delay the arms, those both delay the closing of the club face. So you have to close it a little bit earlier or differently in order to account for that. Okay, we'll jump back to Tim Ford, who asked about the motorcycle. It's one of the terms that we use to look at the shaft rotation. So basically looking at if you have a club face like this, twisting around its axis. And it's typically done by the left wrist. And his question was, how much, when, what do you do if you're having too much? How does it relate to shaft lean, and how does it relate to side bend? And he asked, what are the best drills to try to encourage it? So bunch of topics jumping into the motorcycle. And I think I saw a couple other questions related to the motorcycle, so we'll jump into that too. Okay, first one, timing of it. The important thing is that it happens by impact. The two most common timings are either to do that motorcycle to end the top of the backswing, or do the motorcycle to start the downswing. But there are a few guys, like say a Phil Mickelson, or a Charles Howell III, or a John Senden, or Rory Sabatini, who have more of a arm pull cast pattern, who will actually do the motorcycle between shaft parallel and impact. So it'll be very much a late twisting of the club. I don't see that one very much with amateurs. Sorry, I think we're back. Hopefully we didn't lose too much. I don't see that pattern very much with amateurs. I tend to see that more with elite level players. They kind of find a way to square it very much late and still keep speed. The problem is with a lot of amateurs, if you do that really late, they don't feel like it's very powerful. So the timing is typically either at the top of the swing or during transition. Not everyone associates the top of the swing with when it's actually happening, so during the backswing is an okay time if you have a hard time coordinating it more in transition. And if you're doing it more in transition, I think there's a speed advantage to doing it that way. But ultimately, it just has to be done before you get to impact. So anytime between takeaway and impact, top of the swing and transition are the two most common. How much? The average is about 25 degrees of rotation at impact, and they'll lose a little bit coming into impact. So I'm going to say average is probably 30 to 40 degrees during the golf swing. So if you started with about 25 degrees of extension of your wrist, that means at impact you might have 10 degrees of flex or 5 degrees of flex, or be pretty close to neutral. If you tend to grip it more weak, so if you're gripping it where the wrist is pretty much straight up and down like this, then the guys who do that on tour would be more like that at impact. Or if you grip it really strong with a lot of extension, then you can still have a little bit of extension in your wrist when you get to impact, and you still did the motorcycle movement. So it's a relative change compared to where it was at setup. What happens if you have too much? Specifically, you talked about at the top of the swing. Well, the more motorcycle you do, the more it allows you to delay the arms and get your body open. When it becomes too much, in my experience, it's almost always too much because the body didn't keep rotating and the arms extended. And if you're going to have more of an arm extension pattern, you may play better from a little bit weaker grip, and you may play better from a little bit less, so more on the 20 degrees of motorcycle rather than the max. And one of the other important things is, if I jump back to that timing, is most of the body-driven swings will tend to have a motorcycle graph that looks pretty gradual. So basically, from the top of the swing down to impact, it will happen kind of smoothly, and it will cover the whole range of motion. What I tend to see cause some problems is, especially if you're more of like a really aggressive arm puller, you'll try to close it, but you'll do it very quickly. So you'll close it like this instead of closing it over the whole downswing. So you close it really rapidly in transition, and then you've got nowhere left to go, and if you don't kind of hold it off on the way through, you may hit more pulls, or you could have leading edge contact. You could get a little bit steep. So we want it to happen at the top of the swing. We want it to happen gradually. We want somewhere around 30 degrees of motorcycle, somewhere in that general zone. How does it relate to shaft lean? The more shaft lean you have, the more the club face will point to the right, so you need that motorcycle movement to square the face. And how does it relate to side bend? Well, typically the more side bend you have, the more you will pull and create shaft lean, and otherwise you'd hit it fat. And so the more side bend you have, typically the more motorcycle you need. A good example is a chip shot, where you're not really going to have a whole lot of side bend, and because you're not going to have a whole lot of side bend, you're not going to have a whole lot of motorcycle movement. You're tending to square the face, even with that wrist having some extension, not really coming in with the wrist bowed. All right, let me jump back into the live questions, which is perfect timing because Bruce, he asked, is the motorcycle move something that is consciously done, or is it the result of something else? I'm going to say both. I've worked with some great players who actively think about doing it. I think that if you do it enough, like let's say you really worked on this for 2 years, you probably don't have to think about it too much, and you'd be able to focus mostly on just kind of having almost like a dead hands feel and more of a body feel. But if you're used to coming down more with an extended wrist and having a big scoop, I think at least for a while you're going to have to feel like you're doing that motorcycle movement. Now the trick is to get when you start trying to go from practicing to playing, you want to shift your focus more from internal thoughts, like I'm going to flex my wrist, to an external thought of more, I'm going to lower my initial flight and I'm going to get the club face more closed. So thinking about the club as opposed to my hands, where in transition it may be great to think about the hands. That can be one useful way to make it feel more unconscious. But so I think that many golfers benefit from doing it consciously, and you do it consciously enough until you don't have to think about it. The danger with thinking about it too consciously is sometimes if you're overly focused on one area, it creates almost a tension in the rest of the body. So it might actually stall your pivot if you're trying to do, like if you have too much of the attention on the wrist. And that's where practice comes in, where you're able to blend a feel of doing the movement, but still being able to swing through the ball, use your legs, use your body, all that stuff. All right, let me jump back to a couple of the pre-questions. So Mark, he was asking, how do you train rotation on the downswing in order to get rid of the slide? So the slide and the scoop typically go hand in hand. What'll happen is I've never seen a golfer who gets a lot of shaft twist and white movement like this and also slides, because if you did, you would tend to have a really steep angle of attack and the low point way forward. So everybody here, I can see that my last demo was off screen. Most of the golfers who I see who struggle with more of a slide, they have more of a trail arm disconnected internal rotation, more of a scoop style release, kind of like this, and then they slide in order to get that low point more forward. So my best bet is if you're trying to get more rotation, you have to set up the arm movements in the club face position that will make it easier to have those arm movements, or to have that that rotation component. The slide complements the flip. The motorcycle movement complements body rotation. So if you have a slide and you have the motorcycle movement, then it becomes a little bit trickier. It's usually looking at muscle imbalances and trying to get more of the engine. So I'd probably do some oblique testing, probably do some glute testing just to see how your rotators are working. But I'd say 9 times out of 10, the slide is more of a compensation for a release pattern than an actual situation itself. Okay, had a question from Jason. He was asking also about the motorcycle. So like I said, this one had a pretty heavy motorcycle theme. He asked about palmar flexing, or just flexing your wrist, as most people call it, in the backswing, how does this relate to the high draw? And what's like, especially if the club is facing really closed or skyward at the top? Well, in order to hit a high draw, you have to have the face close to the path, and you need to have the path right of the target. In order to get the high component, you need to have either high enough club head speed in order to get high enough spin, or you need to have a high enough launch. But in order to get it to draw, you need to have the path more out to the right for a right-handed golfer and the club face closed. So having the club face closed during the backswing, kind of rolling those hands under, can basically guarantee that you're going to have a ball that curves more to the left or draws. So I always say if you're trying to make it draw, then working on the face to path relationship is a really strong component to start with. As far as it getting too close at the top, I talked about that earlier. That's only a problem if you also, if your arm extension timing, if you're swinging more at the golf ball instead of through the golf ball, that can be a problem. But if you're trying to draw the ball, I would rather err on having the club face too closed rather than too open. Those key movements being the shaft rotation and the path out to the right are the two key movements you've got to work on. Okay, one last question from here, and then we'll jump back into some of the live questions. And this was a good one. Chris was asking about some of these matching pieces. So you've got Dustin Johnson, who appears to have more of a non-stop rotation through impact, and then you've got Phil Mickelson, who's got more of a stall flip pattern. And then he actually used Rory, so today's winner, who gets really open but still also stalls. And then he asked, all right, you've got golfers who have the pelvis more open, the pelvis more square, the torso more open, torso more square. What do you do? So here's my overall hierarchy. You want to look at the skills you're trying to train, and then you add the movements to improve the skills. So the main skills are controlling the face to path relationship, which will help control whether it goes straight or curves right or curves left. Controlling the path, which includes mostly low point and swing direction. So basically hitting it solidly, and then creating speed. So if you're for example, a golfer like Phil Mickelson, in order for his pattern, what I've seen with golfers who tend to be more of that arm pull, club steepening, and then kind of flip stall on the way through. Here's what the main problem with that pattern is if they swing hard, they tend to lose club face control. So they tend to lose start line, and they tend to have wild misses. So if that's your pattern, and let's say you had to play tomorrow, you're not going to have time to change that pattern. I highly recommend working on tempo. The guys who've had that pattern and who've been very accurate tend to really throttle back. So they tend to be swinging more around 70, 75%, not 90%. If you have a mental constitution where you want to swing hard and you really want to hit the ball as hard as you can, then you would probably be more accurate with a little bit more shallow shaft, earlier face, body rotation. So again, it's all about matching those pieces. So Rory has an unbelievable pattern, especially for driver, but he can struggle with more of his wedge proximity, and he can struggle with putting. Those might be related to why he's such a good driver of the golf ball. So when you're looking at how open the body is, how open the chest or the hips are, you want to factor in what you're physically capable of, what your capabilities are, what skills you're trying to improve, and then go from there. If you're trying to work on low point control and you've got a major stall and your body is close to the target, well, then you'll probably do better getting more open. So just thinking through the pattern as far as what you want to work on, and then jumping back to it, or working on the complementary pieces, that's the pattern I like to use. Okay, it looks like Kevin, he's asked, when I try to flatten the shaft in transition and then look at the video on down the line, I never get into my typical top of backswing spot. I get low and flat, anticipating the flattening move too early. So what that can either be good or that can be bad. So like, you know, a golfer like more of a Jason Duffner tends to have more of a flattening movement during the backswing. So then he can be a little more aggressive during transition and not get too steep. But if you are working on shallowing, then if you're too flat too early, then it's going to be hard to shallow from that position. So one drill that could possibly help is doing drills where you hit from the top. So you go up to the top and stall. It will take away some of your upper body power source typically, and allow you the time and space to work on either shallowing, motorcycle movement, or sequencing and using the lower body, which we'll get into in a little bit. Okay, another live question. Jason asked, is the motorcycle and ulnar deviation done at the same time? Do you need the hips open at impact to have forward shaft lean on a full swing? I'm gonna say, let me answer the second one first. I'm gonna say yes. The lowest I've ever seen on a Tour Pro is about 20 degrees open with their lower body. With amateurs, I've seen actually closed at impact, so it's possible to do. I can't imagine that you would have your pelvis closed and still get the hands ahead and not have a really steep angle of attack. That becomes the problem. Is you have to understand that the angle of attack and the amount of shaft lean are independent variables, and if you don't get your body open enough, it's hard to have shaft lean and not have a steep angle of attack. Okay, now the second one is the motorcycle and ulnar deviation done at the same time. Pretty much. Now here's one of the tricks or the caveats to that. The right hand and the left hand are typically doing slightly different things in the golf swing. So especially during the early part of the downswing, because of how the right hand is on the club, the increased lag typically happens more from the trail wrist in order to get the good pressure point, and in order to go into external rotation, in order to load the wrist. All that happens in that trail wrist. In order to start squaring the face, that lead wrist is going to tend to go into more of that motorcycle movement, and because of some of those coupled motions, you'll tend to go into a little bit more ulnar deviation at the same time. So that's why you'll frequently see golfers' grips change a little bit on the club by the time they get to impact. I believe Phil Chin said it was about 20 degrees in his most recent research, but the hands definitely change on the grip. So yes, to your question, motorcycle and UD are typically done at about the same time. If you had to break it down to kind of the nano movements, motorcycle would happen slightly before the ulnar deviation. Okay, Big Will asked, what type of swing movements or characteristics are the easiest on the lower back? And is a lower back friendly swing incompatible with high club head speed? The simple answer is yes. The higher velocity, the more stress that's going to come back through your body. Now, if you can distribute that through your whole body, then you can handle it repetition. You can handle it 500 reps a day or over the course of a decade. Like, you can put in a lot of reps. But if you already have an area that's kind of a weak point, like your lower back, then the faster that you swing, potentially the more stress you're going to put into that area, especially if using the lower back is one of the major ways you create speed, or your bracing strategy puts extra stress in the lower back. So if I had to design a lower back friendly swing, one of the most important things that I would try to include would be more of a gradual tempo through impact, so that there was no real jarring movement. You could potentially get more speed from your arms, but one of the big keys would be trying to have really soft arms, soft shoulders, soft jaw to create less of an impulse at impact and more of kind of a gradual absorption of that speed. Now the hard thing is that might not be how you feel powerful, but it wouldn't really cost you too much in terms of club head speed. All right, let me get back to a few of these good email questions that I got, and then hopefully we'll tie things up with a few more of the live questions. So Robbie asked about footwork. It's footwork. His question was basically, footwork is often talked about, like, hey, footwork is really important, but it's not really discussed in too much detail. What do I like to see in the full swing? So I'll give kind of just a real quick overview of footwork, because you can get into specific details, and should the footwork of someone who has more of a pronated foot or a neutral foot or even a varus foot, would their footwork be exactly the same? It's hard to say. Okay, the basic pattern that I like to see is, let's talk about three main movements of the foot. We'll talk about kind of rolling or pronation, supination of the foot. We'll talk about flexing or kind of pushing through the ground, and then we'll talk about like rotating the ankle or pivoting the foot this way. In general, the pattern that you're going to see with good ball strikers is they're going to pronate the foot first, then they're going to push through the ground, and then around impact, or usually after impact, they'll start to go into rotation. Typically what happens with amateurs is they don't roll the foot, they'll push, and then they'll go into rotation. So he asked, what's something you can look for on video? One easy way is, if we're looking at the foot and you kind of had a line on the outside of the foot, what you'll tend to see is during the downswing, the foot would never, like the heel would never cross through that line. Typically, if they're not rolling or extending, if they're getting into that rotation first, they'll pivot more around the toe of the trail foot, and you'll see that heel go away from the target first. So that should help give you kind of an overview, at least, of what's going on with the trail foot. The lead foot is a little bit simpler. It's just the weight gets into the toe, and then it translates into the heel. How it translates into the heel and what the hip and the shoulders are doing, it's probably a little bit more detailed. But the trail foot itself is a little bit more complicated. It's just got this banking movement, which happens more from the midfoot, and then the push movement, which happens more from the hip, and then the rotation, which happens more as a result of what the arms are doing on the way through. Okay, Patrick asked a question about Davis Love, describing a pull the quiver this way and asking how does that actually create power. So he sent a video of basically Davis Love talking about how at the top of the swing he tries to pull that way as opposed to pulling down. And what happens is, in the transition, if I'm actually pushing this way with that left hand, that will tend to cause a little bit more trail wrist extension and really good loading of those arms. That tends to allow me to work more rotationally, tends to allow me to work more with my whole body. If I tend to get pulling more down vertically with the arms, that will tend to kick the club out, which would feel like the wrists are going more that way. So pushing out almost encourages that downswing lag, which contributes to better sequencing and total body contribution. And that sequencing and total body contribution can relate to speed generation. Let's see. Fred asked a couple questions. I'll take on his first two. So he asked, the lower body in the backswing, is it detrimental to have the lower body drop down in the backswing? He specifically talked about the head. The hard thing is the head is not one of the more accurate things to measure 3D wise, because at least on AMM they use the sensor to digitize the rest of the body. Some of the other systems are a little bit better with the head, but most of the 3D data I've seen is AMM. And the other thing is, you could have you could have your head lower in a variety of different ways. You could have your head lower from side bend. You could have your head lower from tucking your chin. You could have your head lower from what your hips are doing. There's a lot of different ways to lower the head. So what I've seen is that the thorax typically on average will drop about 1 to 2 inches if you assume that the neck stays pretty much neutral or even shortens from getting into a little bit of left tilt. Then you would expect that most people's heads would drop a little bit in the backswing. So I would say that that's not going to be detrimental as far as creating speed. His second question was from the face on, how do you get fully rotated at P8? So for those not familiar with the P system, let's say impact is P7. They kind of go through. So P8 is about when the shaft is parallel to the ground. And basically asking, how do I get my body facing the target? Now, the biggest barrier to getting your body open at P8 is the amount of rotation in that lead hip. So making sure that you have enough left foot turnout or left foot flare so that your body can face the target is one of the biggest barriers. If that's not the case, if you can get there without a golf club, if you can just pose it, then it usually comes down to club face or low point control. And basically, you're using earlier arm action in order to square the face or control low point. And so you got to do a little investigating and figure out which of those two it is, because they have slightly different solutions. All right, back to the live questions. Ryan is asking, I fight a steep hook pattern with early extension, working on the motorcycle to shallow, but struggle to delay the arms long enough to avoid closed face. Trying to get the body open to impact steepens the path and defeats my shallowing progress. Any suggestions? It is one of the more frustrating patterns when you're steep and from the inside, which can cause steep miss patterns as well as hook or overly into out patterns. Okay, so how do you, I would say that I'm just going off a hunch based on your description, but the ulnar deviation is probably the bigger key shallowing movement than getting the arm extension, the arm rotation. So working on getting the club to be more down back there will allow your body to rotate without getting too steep. The problem is that body rotation, if you have the shaft in a neutral position, will tend to cause the club to swing on more of a lower vertical swing plane and tend to get really steep. So working on shallowing and almost pointing back about 45 degrees and then allowing that body rotation to take the arms a little bit more around to the left. I've got a number of sites drills on the site, the Hit My Arms drill, the drill with the foam rollers, hands in, club out. There's a bunch of different ways to work on that follow-through side. And then the isolated, unhinged impact, face rotation with an impact bag are a couple different ways there. But there's a variety for working on ulnar deviation or unhinge. If you search those topics on the site, they will probably point you in the right direction of how to shallow and how that works with body rotation. All right, we're going to do just a couple more. I don't think we'll be able to get to everybody's questions today because I've got a few left on the emails, and I can see there's half a dozen or so here. So we'll probably schedule another Q&A in the next week or so. All right, let's see. Nick is asking, can you explain how and why the COM moves upward at the change of direction? How do you get the ulnar deviation without early releasing? So that kind of relates to the quiver question as far as how the COM moves upward. Basically, let's see the easiest way to phrase this. If I was to pull down, when you're looking at the overall force and you're looking at the COM, you want to look at, okay, if here's my golf club, the balance point is right around here, right? So one of the classic examples is Sergio is someone who probably does not have the force going upward in transition because his if you look at that point during transition, it will actually come down. The hard thing is where most people have it, if you tried to pull that down, either your body would get in the way, you wouldn't be able to really rotate, because you'll watch, if I keep my hands on the club and I rotate my body, the center here actually travels slightly up that way and around. So it would be really hard to get the center of mass to go downward first during that early part of transition. You would have to have, one way would be to kind of delay any wrist cock and then really kind of load it on the way down. But it would also take usually staying really close to the target, more like Sergio. If you start rotating with your body, your hands are going to tend to follow the chest rotation or the body rotation, and that's typically going to cause a little bit of the COM moving upward. How do you get ulnar deviation without early releasing? I've got a couple of videos on casting versus or how ulnar deviation relates to lag, and basically ulnar deviation doesn't necessarily create early releasing, because there's two different ways to look at early releasing. One would be the vertical height, and then two would be the rotational movement. And so I can ulnar deviate and still keep the club way behind rotationally so that I still have lag coming into impact. The opposite, I could get the club in front of me and keep the club up really high, and I'd have to release earlier in order to shallow it out and get the hands down or get the club down to impact. So looking at the club being more behind as a source of lag might change your definition of early releasing, because most of the tour pros I've seen have significantly much earlier ulnar deviation than what most people think. Okay, let me jump back to the last couple questions here, and then I'll just have to I'll save the questions that have been asked and be sure to answer those at the beginning next time. So, all right, Fred asks about the stock tour swing, and basically what would normal pelvis bends, kinematic sequence, pelvic angles look like. Is there a difference between the iron and the driver? Okay, so from the pelvis bend, basically maintaining your core as you go into the backswing. So the graph would basically look like it has more of a flat line instead of really dropping down or even going up. There might be a little bit of extension in the transition phase, and then there'll be a pretty good posterior tilt or using of the abs during transition, or sorry, during the release. The pelvis angle is looking at side bend. Typically during the side bend, you'll have somewhere around 10 degrees of left tilt in the backswing and then right tilt during the downswing. And kinematic sequence wise, there's lots of information about the kinematic sequence. I think having a transition sequence of lower body, arms and club somewhere around the same time, but after lower body and peaking order all makes sense. I don't think that it has to be quite as clean as what has been touted before. I've seen a lot of really good ball strikers who don't have what would be called a perfect kinematic sequence or perfect peaking order, but transition sequence and the club accelerating all the way to impact are two patterns that I typically look for. The difference between the iron and the driver, kinematic sequence wise, when you get to short irons, they become more of a cast pattern, less of this really dynamic load, and they'll tend to be less of axis tilt. I did a video or a presentation a couple years ago at the World Golf Fitness Summit on the 3D differences between the two. I'd say that would be a good place to start if you're looking for the graphs. Okay, Brian had a question about transition power sources. He asked, how is the crunch or side bend a power source? He kind of understood how the back extension could be a power source, but he was having a hard time with how could a crunch or side bend be the power source. Well, basically anything that I can do to move this club can be a power source. And so when I flex my trunk, imagine like a soccer throw-in. That would be more of a flex pattern, or imagine an axeman using, or a lumberjack using a hammer, or using an axe or a sledgehammer. That forward flexion pattern of that crunch can be very powerful. The side bend is a little trickier to see because it's usually not a major power source in a lot of other activities, but it can be more of an oblique type thing, and it can really help with pulling those arms down. That can be a big barrier for golfers who struggle with wedge play, is getting more of that vertical drop from side bend power source as opposed to just letting the arms fall. But anything that moves the grip can be a power source, and because we want to go into more of a positive torsion, a combination of flexing forward and rotating and side bending during the early part of the downswing, going into that back extension usually causes more problems than the speed benefits. If you're a long drive guy and you're always hitting it off a tee, then the extension power source makes a lot of sense. But if you have to control low point, it becomes a bit of a problem. Okay, last question. Guy asked about lordosis in the transition, and basically, Kelvin Miyahara has talked about kind of some of the spinal engine stuff and locking the facet joints. I'm not 100% on. I'm not 100% convinced that happens in golf. In order to lock the facet joints, you would need to go into full range of motion or go near full extension. So let's say that you've got somewhere between 20 and 40 degrees of spine extension in the lumbar spine. I don't see that much extension. What I typically see on 3D graphs is maybe a few degrees, up to 5 degrees of kind of going in that anterior tilt. That can stretch the obliques and preload the abs so that then when you rotate them, it becomes a power source. But I don't see it as a spinal engine lumbar locking. I'd have to see some higher numbers in terms of extension side bend for me to buy into that pattern. So I'm a bigger fan of training more of a unified or connected core instead of just trying to extend the lumbar spine. I like to think of the whole spine working as a unit, starting at the sacrum, and if you're going to work that way, it's tending to go into more of a positive torsion, not so much the extension, and you'll just have a little bit of maybe a stretch shortened beforehand. Okay, so like I said, I will write down or I'll copy all the questions that I didn't get to this time, and we'll get another live Q&A scheduled hopefully in the next week or so. I want to thank everybody for tuning in. If you're not a member of the site and you want to check it out, there's a link. Go check out Golf Smart Academy. You can sign up for a free version and check out the videos for a week. I'm pretty proud. Try to keep them regularly updated and answer your questions and provide hopefully a long-term pathway for learning. If you're looking for more of an A to Z style, then please check out my book, The Stock Tour Swing, available on Amazon. I hear that it's getting some good love on WRX. It kind of highlights the big picture of all the pieces and how they fit together. So if you're struggling, if you're kind of more of a learner of the game and you want to really understand, I would highly recommend checking that out. If you have any questions, you can shoot me an email at support@golfsmartacademy.com or post them here before I close it, and I will do my best to get them answered at the next Q&A. So greetings again from Montreal. Hopefully everybody enjoyed the golf today, and I look forward to answering more of your questions at the next live Q&A session.